Hey, welcome back to Zombie Tactics. Today, the title of the video, Harrison Bergeron, Idiocracy and Statistics. And it's a follow-on video to one I just recently did called Fantasy, Fiction, and Reality. And the title comes from a book entitled Harrison Bergeron, written by Kurt Vonnegut. And it, among other things, shows a time in the future where all that anybody wants to be is average, and it's actually considered sort of a moral problem and actually a crime to a certain extent if you're above average or particularly intelligent. That's not all the book's about, but there's a lot of that goes on in the book, and there's people that are like they're anxiously awaiting their child to be tested to make sure that he's just average. They don't want him to be anything more than average in intelligence. And of course the movie that some of you have seen, it's a comedy movie, Idiocracy, where there's a time in the future where everybody is just stupid because everything's gone to the lowest common denominator. It's actually something of a liability to be smart in a world like that because you just can't relate to all the stupid people around you. And of course statistics, which is something that I want to talk about more and more. I'm talking specifically, of course, about things having to do with firearms handling and self-defense situations, things like that. But it relates to a lot of things in life because there are statistics that I'm going to call them common knowledge statistics. I'm not going to call them common sense statistics because a lot of times there isn't any sense behind them, and when you look into them you find out that the statistics don't even really say what people think they say. It's kind of like there's a big game of telephone that gets started. You get 30 people together. If you've never played this game, you whisper a message into one person's ear, and they whisper it into the next person's ear, and then they whisper it in the next person's ear. And unless you're extremely careful to get the message straight, you can start out with a message like, the Academy Awards are on Sunday, and by the time you get to the end, the person on the other end thinks that the message is tuna fish causes cancer. It can be really that extreme, the difference, because people make subtle changes as they copy that message from person to person. Now, there are ways to get around that, and maybe that'll be an interesting conversation sometime for another video. But that kind of thing happens with statistics, too. People will hear a statistic, and they kind of repeat that statistic absent the context that statistic is supposed to have and what its real meaning is. And it gets passed on from person to person, and before you know it, people think all kinds of things have been studied and are true that haven't been studied and aren't true and aren't based on statistics and aren't based on any kind of reasonable scientific study or experimentation at all. But it's common knowledge that it's true. And we'll go into some of these in this video and others. It has to do with human potential, and again having to do with firearms and self-defense, but also you can apply this to so many areas of your life. One of these things is, for instance, I know that I've studied that almost everyone has a phobic aversion, a phobia about traveling at very high speed in an automobile. You can get most people, the vast majority of people, you can get them up to about 100 to 110 miles per hour without any problems at all, and they'll kind of be doing a little bit of white knuckling it, but not a complete phobic animal terror reaction to speed. The majority of people, you get them up about 120, 130 miles per hour at the outset, and they begin to have an actual animal instinct reaction of fear. It is that lizard brain in the back, the same kind of thing that happens when somebody has an irrational fear of being locked in a closet. They're claustrophobic, or they're afraid of crowds, or whatever. I kind of feel like I ought to be Lucy in the old cartoon shaking the can for a nickel, but I digress. But most people have that fear of traveling at a high rate of speed. So if you took a look at that statistic and you applied it the way most people do in common knowledge, you'd say, well, most people can't drive a car faster than 120 miles per hour. Now notice how it's already changed. I changed it from most people have a phobic reaction to speed at that speed to most people can't drive a car 120 miles per hour or faster. It got changed a little bit. And then that would get changed by the next person, and then they'd say, well, the vast majority of people cannot drive a car faster than 120 miles per hour. The next person changes it, and it's like, oh gosh, hardly anybody can get above 110 miles per hour without, getting in a wreck. And, before long, you get to the point where common knowledge is that nobody can drive faster than 100 miles per hour. That's how that would work if that's the way that it was applied, the same way that it's applied in some other areas of life. Except that in that area of life, we know better because we know people who drive faster than that all the time. They're called race car drivers, and there are thousands of them, and they do it all the time. And, by the way, the majority in this case of people who will have that phobic reaction about 120, 130 miles per hour is nowhere near an extreme majority, but people, when they're trying to make a case, they fudge the numbers. Oh, yeah, almost nobody can go above 110 miles per hour without freaking out completely. The other thing is, we would never accept that because a lot of us have traveled faster than that. I come from a background, my dad was a race car driver in his younger years, and I have no trouble, I'm not saying how I know this, getting a car above 200 miles per hour and not having it freak me out at all. It's just a matter of, driving the car right. So I don't have that phobic reaction for whatever reason, but a lot of people do. A majority of the population does, but nowhere near an extreme majority, okay? And we talked about how that could get into the common knowledge by that kind of telephone type transmission of information if it wasn't for the fact that we all knew better than that. Similarly, large parts of the population have other phobic reactions, but we would never be fooled into thinking that almost everybody has that because we know better. Not everybody's afraid of confined spaces and things like that. One of the most common other phobic reactions is the fear of speaking in public. It is defined in many pieces of literature as one of the greatest fears that a majority of the population has. And by the way, this is a pretty decided majority. Something like 60-70% of the people polled and surveyed and studied in various ways have a fear of speaking in public that is so great that they will say, at least on paper, that they'd rather die. And I don't know how many of them would rather die, actually, but we know for a fact that people have died. They've died from stage fright. It is such a terrible, stark, raving fear of a thing that they will actually have a heart attack or some kind of neurological reaction to it, and they'll die. More commonly, people will faint or they will get flustered and they can't find their words. They'll forget the words to songs, they'll forget their speeches, or whatever. Now, I've personally experienced that at a very young age when I first started trying to do things like, sing in public and speak in public. I would completely just vapor lock, fear, looking out into the crowd, going, gah! That kind of thing. But I know that over time, I've gotten to the point where it's the other way around. You can put me in front of a crowd of any size, and I can speak on any subject that I know something about without any trouble at all. As a matter of fact, it's probably a little bit more trouble to get me to shut up. That brings me to the other point, which is, even though these things may be, most people are this way, most people are that way, all of these things are things that can be trained around. Just because someone has a fear of traveling above a certain rate of speed in an automobile doesn't mean that with exposure and training and just kind of dulling your perceptions of it by constant exposure to it, that you can't get to a level where you could exceed that by quite a bit. Same thing happened to me with stage fright. Same thing happens to people that have all kinds of other fears out there. I know a gentleman who is frightened beyond belief of speaking in public, and he's a well-known public speaker. Think about that for a second. He gets paid to do something that he's scared to death to do, and he does it well. All kinds of performers like Barbra Streisand, John Lennon, all kinds of people like that, they're known to throw up, were known, in John's case, to throw up before they went on stage because they were so freaked out by the thing. But they went on to perform at a very high level under what is some of the highest stress that we know that a person can feel, which is that stark, raving animal fear. So where does that kind of get to things? I hear all kinds of things about handgun performance that are all based upon averages, and they're averages that go something like this. And I'm not going to go into these statistics right now and whether or not they're true. That's a subject for another video. Let's just assume they're all true for now. You'll hear this phrase, well, the average gunfight is 3 shots, 3 seconds, and within 3 feet. And you'll hear that to the point where people will say, well, almost all gunfights are 3 shots, 3 seconds, 3 feet. Let's just assume that's true, for instance. Does that mean that that is deterministic of your level of performance, or does that mean that's the gunfight that you're going to have to deal with, the self-defense situation that you're going to have to deal with? Not necessarily. That's just an application of a statistic that may or may not have anything to do with your situation. We know that military and police organizations, they train to a certain standard. You have to be able to get that rifle up on target and make a marksmanship-like shot within a certain number of seconds. And the police have to be able to do the same thing to be able to qualify with a pistol. But we can get to the point where we think, oh, that statistic, that standard, that's the gold standard. That statistic that's the thing that we're shooting for. And anything better than that, oh my God, that's like superhuman performance. Nobody could ever do that. And it's not true. Those are just statistics, and we can't be bound by them. In many cases, they are just an expression of averages. You say, well, the average person cannot do this with a handgun. The average person can't do that with a rifle. The average person can't do this when under stress. Now, we know that under stress, your performance level always goes down in most areas, but believe it or not, in some areas, your performance level can actually go up if you're extremely well trained. That performance anxiety, for instance, in stage fright, actually gives energy to a performance to the point where their performance is more energetic, and it pushes them to excel at a level they would have never excelled before. Now, we know in the case of handgunnery or self-defense that the common phrase is that, like, well, you're going to be as half as you've ever been on the range, half as good as you've ever been on the range. And that may or not be true. I really don't know if it's true, but I have a stinking suspicion that that's another thing that can be trained around. And I kind of suspect that because I've talked to some people who've said that, people who've been in combat who say, I shoot better in combat than I do on the range. And it's because I've learned to control that energy and focus it into the task at hand. I'm just kind of researching that thing. But the point that I kind of want to make is this. Don't let these statistics be deterministic for you. You would never for a minute say, well, the average person can't kick a 60-foot field goal. So we're going to train our football team so that the place kicker, he will only ever have to make, what are average field goals. 30 yards, let's just say. And training for anything more than that, oh my God, that's just crazy. Hardly anybody can consistently make three-point shots from outside the key in basketball. So we're not going to train for that. We're going to only train for layups because that's the typical, thing that's done. And we're going to pretend that, oh God, hardly anybody can do that. Now, see, you see the silliness of that because even at a high school level, these things happen with enough regularity that we know that people can be trained to a high degree of proficiency, even though the averages say the average person cannot do that. So let's not let those things be a tyranny on us. Let us not let them box our minds in and say, well, this is all we can accomplish because those are the averages and I shouldn't think outside the box at all. No, we want to push that box out there and we want to say, I'm going to operate at the level of my capabilities and the level of my training, and I'm going to push myself to accomplish what I can accomplish. The averages be damned. That's just a little zombie tactics philosophy for tonight, and we'll see you next time. More on this subject coming up. See you next time. Bye-bye.